¿Listo? Ok. Bueno, pues muchas gracias a todas y todos por estar el día de hoy con nosotros. La verdad es que estamos muy contentos de tener aquí a la doctora Emily Campbell. Ella es profesora de Rhode Island College y Faculty Fellow en el Centro de Sociología Cultural de la Universidad de Yale. La verdad es que le agradecemos muchísimo que nos pueda acompañar el día de hoy aquí en este taller, que será de 2 días, sobre la teoría de la esfera civil y el estudio de caso cualitativo que se llevará pues estos días aquí en la FLACSO México. Muchísimas gracias a todas y todos ustedes. La doctora Emily va a dar su conferencia, su charla en inglés, pero cualquier comentario que ustedes tengan lo pueden hacer sin en español. Ella perfectamente el español. Nada más que como ustedes ya saben, cuando uno hace el tránsito teórico de un idioma a otro, luego se complica un poco las cosas. Entonces, Emily se siente un poco más cómoda en la parte, hablando en inglés, pero podemos conversar con ella en español. Entonces, puede ser un diálogo bilingüe bastante interesante. Emily, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos aquí en la FLACSO México. Y pues adelante. Así que el piso es todo tuyo.
Vale,
Bienvenida.
gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias. Pues buenos días y gracias a profesor Nelson Arteaga Botello por la invitación y a ustedes por estar aquí conmigo. Voy a abrir la pantalla. ¿Eso ya se ve? ¿Bien? Ok.
Ya, está bien.
¿Y el audio está bien? Es que se escuche así bastante fuerte. Ok.
Para darle solemnidad.
Vale. Ok, gracias. Pues hoy vamos a hablar de la teoría de esfera civil y el estudio de caso cualitativo. Como ha dicho el profesor, que en general voy a presentar en inglés, pero cualquier cosa, en cualquier momento podemos cambiar a idioma. Es que al preparar la presentación he dado cuenta que jamás he pensado sobre esta teoría en español y me ha costado bastante. Entonces, gracias por su atención y podemos cambiar entre idiomas por eso. Pues la agenda que tengo es bastante lleno y si no llegamos a todo está bien porque tenemos 2 días y vamos viendo cómo va y cómo sirve a ustedes también, que me interesa mucho en qué están trabajando los temas y cómo puede servir estos temas a sus propias investigaciones. Pues el día, pienso primero, bueno, un resumen muy rápido, un repaso de la teoría de esfera civil, que ya ustedes ya conocen bastante bien, pero vamos a repasarlo por todas partes, por todos temas. Las estructuras de binarias de significado, que también, bueno, es uno de los temas más importantes que podemos trabajar en el análisis de los casos cualitativos. También voy a hablar un poco de la importancia del estudio de casos cualitativos en el uso de la teoría y cómo avanzamos la teoría utilizando este método. Y después voy a hablar más sobre método que nada. Y método sea de investigación propia y datos originales, más que nada, que es normal que trabajemos con datos que no, a veces una combinación de datos originales y datos secundarios, pero quiero hablar más que nada de la recolección de datos originales en sus varias partes. Y luego, si da tiempo, vamos a hablar sobre entrevistas y cómo hacer una buena entrevista y sacar datos útiles para analizar, para servir a la teoría. Y, bueno, es todo lo que voy a decir ahora. Mañana pienso más en trabajar la etnografía y la sociología visual también y fotografía y también como me voy a informar lo que va a servir también por el discurso que tenemos hoy juntos. Bueno, voy a cambiar ya de idioma y hablar. sobre el tema. Pues, okay, so civil sphere theory, as you guys are probably familiar with at this point because of your study here, is a theory of democracy. And it's chiefly concerned with the practice of social solidarity. And democracy is seen as a dynamic social process that's an ongoing accomplishment. So democracy isn't just something one has, it's not something outside ourselves, but it's something that is constantly in flux and constantly being negotiated from one way or another, right? And the civil sphere itself is comprised of the regulative institutions of elections, office and the rule of law, and communicative institutions of a free press, public opinion, and civic organizations, right? So these regulative and communicative institutions kind of work together to create a dynamic civil sphere. But even just focusing on each individual institution, we can find a lot of robust places for us to spend time studying and advancing the theory itself, right, of how the civil sphere works in each of these respective institutions. So within the civil sphere and the practice of social solidarity, one of the most important themes is that social solidarity is in its binary structures of meaning allow for the expansion, right, and for more inclusion, but also create the possibility for exclusion and retraction as well. So a tightening of who is included within society itself, right? Within democratic societies, the majority of them, right, at least within the United States, our founding documents have universalist aspirations, even though in practice they're not universally applied. But that universalist aspiration allows for people to invoke that language to expand and demand more inclusion, right? So universal expansion is possible discursively, at least, and then in the practice, people will struggle for that as well, right? So I pulled this directly from Jeffrey Alexander's book, so you can see the font is the same, but we can see the binary motives of civil and anti-civil, and this is attributed to actors, right, within the civil sphere of who's civil, who's considered anti-civil, and this language is not partisan, so to speak. It's used by all political players, all different types of social actors to clarify who is part and who is not of the civil sphere itself, right? And I won't go through the details of this, right? But this comes, it's a neo-Durkheimian approach, just these basic binaries of good and evil and thinking through those in the context of democratic societies. Relations as well, we see binary structures of meaning: open, secretive, trusting, suspicious, critical, deferential, right? These structures of relations also help us to understand whether something is actually doing the work of expansion or exclusion as well, right? And the reason I put this right at the front of the talk today is I think this language is very useful to keep in mind as we analyze cases, as we analyze our interviews in particular, right? Institutions, we went through the regulative and communicative institutions, how they're described, how they're understood, how they're experienced by the people within them and impacted by them is important for democratic society and democratic culture overall. And we can see that these basic and enduring qualities are how open and well-functioning civil institutions are described or not described. So dysfunction, we can see, is described as exclusive, built by personality, it's arbitrary, whereas civil democratic is ruled by law, it advances equality and inclusivity, right? So these themes kind of transfer through different scales, so to speak, of analysis, which also can enable us to think about what our scale of analysis is if we're looking at the institutional level or individual political actors themselves as well. So the qualitative case study is a very central part of civil sphere theory, and it allows us to zoom in on the dynamics of the civil sphere in a way that isn't really possible through another method, right? Especially for processual accounts, because civil sphere theory is dynamic, right? It's about change. It doesn't assume that democracy is stable. We can see that this processual account is really well served through the case study itself, right? So processual concepts like collective trauma, civil repair, and civil incorporation, among others, do very well in the case study model, right? And we can see in the civil sphere itself, the book, the original book by Jeffrey Alexander in 2006, he uses the case study approach to advance his theory and show how this actually works in democratic societies, how his theory really plays out. I just wanted to briefly note, right, just to highlight again the importance of this, just a brief glance through I'm going now between Spanish and English. Excuse me. In my mind, it's like, it's always easier when you speak. Yeah. Every day, it's always best if you just speak one language for the whole day. I think that's the general theory, but we're doing our best here. So in any case, looking at the civil sphere in Latin America, looking at the book, we can see that a number of the chapters are using the case study method, right? And how the scope of the case study varies quite widely to something very, very specific, to something quite ambitious, right? Like democracy and authoritarianism, right? But nonetheless, it's very well served overall. The theories being advanced through these methods. So having a good handle on how to do the case study is going to, of course, enable us to advance theory. So I'm going to move in now to the data collection and qualitative case studies. And some of this may be, I would imagine, review for many of you. I just wanted to ask now, how many people have experience doing original data collection? And on what topics have you done so? If we could maybe open this up a little bit. Yes?
I work on political means, so I would like to run directly on. Gracias. Yeah, so I was saying I have worked recollecting political memes. I'm focused on the Mexican political spectrum, and yeah, well, I'm also in my investigation, and I'm working on well, the objective is to do some interviews, and I'm also working on a digital ethnography of specific groups on Facebook, and also some accounts on Twitter. So, well, X, and that's
Okay,
it.
great. Could you say your name?
Yeah, sure. My name is Alan Mosqueda. I'm here at the PhD program in FLACSO, Mexico, and my mention is the political science.
Oh, okay, wonderful. And who do you hope to do the interviews with for the research?
Yeah, mainly the creators of memes, and also the moderators of these groups. But I also want to interview the members of these groups to get a grasp on the meaning that they posit on the memes, or how they interpret the the different discourses around them.
That's great. Great, fascinating. Anyone else is in the data collection phase or has already done some data collection?
Bueno, yo, por ejemplo, voy a hablar en español.
Claro.
Mi nombre es Camilo.
Camilo.
También estoy en el doctorado en la línea de sociología. Yo estoy estudiando el tema de la violencia en México, los espacios de violencia a través de los iconos, cómo se iconografizan los espacios de violencia. Voy a hacer análisis de archivo y voy a hacer también entrevistas.
Qué bien. ¿Y las entrevistas, con quién va?
Todavía estoy viendo bien esa cuestión, pero me gustaría hacer entrevistas, por ejemplo, a periodistas, a personas que pertenecen a los colectivos de búsqueda.
Mm.
y no sé si a funcionarios. Eso todavía lo tengo que decidir, pero hasta el momento eso.
Muy interesante. Muy bien. ¿Alguno?
Well, I'm Adrián Vidal. I'm also working in my data collection phase right now, also with the civil field theory and in the PhD. So I'm kind of dividing my phase first on a non-participant observation, where I will go, my topic of research is manosphere and incel spaces in digital, in internet, basically. And the first phase would be like non-participant observation, where I will go and make like a digital archive or something like that. And I will collect data in forums or social networks around certain events of violence and how these communities have received and interpreted these events. And then maybe in a second phase, I would go in participant observation, like an ethnographical approach. And then I'm thinking about doing some non-structured interviews, but I'm not sure who would be the person that I would interview right now.
Mm-hmm. And may I ask, so this is in Mexico?
And it is in the US because there are 3 cases that I'm considering. One in the US, another in Canada, and the third one in Mexico.
Oh, okay. So it'd be quite a lot.
Yes. But because the digital spaces, they are transnational.
Transnational.
Yes. Then that would be the way to limit them somehow.
Sure. But they are popular because I'm familiar with it in the United States, but it is also, there are people participating in this in Mexico as well.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
There's been a recent case in the past year.
Okay.
Let me tell you that there are some people on computer and in the seminar that we have with the students, we have another research about UFC, this sport in Mexico and in the United States. And Melissa is in charge of this research, and she's planning to do some interviews with the audience of the UFC. And the other research is about OnlyFans.
Oh.
Okay, and there are in this particular research, it's about how people inside the OnlyFans is working in their bodies and their images in front of the internet. Yeah. There are some research about that. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Fascinating. A lot of digital, which is great. Yeah. Really interesting. Okay. This is helpful for me to, as I plan, especially for tomorrow, to think about how to organize things. So in general, I'm going to be talking about, we're looking at interviews today. But what I'm going to go through now is some of the best practices about ethnography and interviews overall, drawing on some literature that is widely cited that I find quite useful, as well as interjecting a few of my own points that I'd like to emphasize myself as a qualitative researcher. So I guess I'll just say very briefly about my own research. I've done research on American political culture in particular in a few areas, so I'll be showing some examples of that, as well as community level research on the social response to the drug overdose crisis in the United States. So I consider myself more community oriented than anything as a qualitative researcher, but I've done more ambitious in terms of scale, looking at kind of state level reform and things like that as well. So that's a little bit about me. I've also done research on, politics and religious actors as well in the past. So I feel very comfortable doing the qualitative research. And, it's part of the fun part of the job. You get to leave the library, leave the office, go out and meet people. So let's get into a little bit of what makes qualitative research high quality, right? So there's this great book that I highly recommend called Qualitative Literacy by Mario Small and Jessica Calarco. And they have created, in this book, they create a typology of how to evaluate high quality qualitative research. And I think this is very useful for us in thinking about how to produce high quality research as well. And, when we're engaging with the literature, seeing is this something worthy of my attention and time. So I'm going to go through these and then add a few more notes as well. So they talk about cognitive empathy as a very important part of, sorry, I'm just pulling this in. Cognitive empathy is a very important part of the qualitative research process. And in some ways, as a qualitative researcher, it's a bit about your own cultivating a personality that enables you to do this, right? So cognitive empathy, the way they talk about it and the way I understand it, is that one is attempting to actually see the world through the eyes of the people you are interviewing or the people you are studying, right? So you're able to kind of suspend judgment and suspend your own, your own self in some ways and really try to understand the world through the eyes of the people you're studying. And I think in this way, it comes through in the data that one is collected. But this is also felt by the people you're studying themselves. If they really feel like you're trying to understand them, they're more likely to be honest with you. And I think this really kind of impacts the full experience of the data collection process itself. So the implication for this, I would say, is just a respectful curiosity is driving one's approach to interviewees and the field overall. Another best practice they outline is heterogeneity. So diversity of experiences is represented. So this can mean both a demographic diversity, social position, ideological position of the people one's studying, but also that there is heterogeneity within groups of people, right? So it transcends stereotypes. So I think of this, the example you just mentioned, right? Studying incels. One would imagine there's a lot of diversity within that group, right? And qualitative research would allow us to kind of open up that world in a way that goes beyond just, the general op-ed that writes about this in maybe a more superficial way. So that diversity is clear, right? And that comes through in it's kind of the textured approach that the researcher takes to explaining what they found to the reader. Another element is palpability, right? So storytelling and concrete details are prioritized, right? And this is often gained through detailed follow-up questions in the case of interview best practices, right? So palpability, when somebody says, oh, I don't like something, right? We can say, oh, they don't like it, and then move on, right? But asking more follow-up questions or why is that the case? What was that like for you? Trying to evoke backstories behind why people have come to the positions they have is very useful, right? And building the concrete details, right? So potentially, these very specific elements about how people make decisions or how they've come to identify themselves with a certain social movement or things of that nature. So the palpability goes beyond just, again, a superficial like or dislike, but we can really start to understand and break down the motivations behind people's behavior and the way that they account for their own life. Other best practices they outline are follow-up. So in general, when one is in the field and collecting data, we will encounter things that surprise us. And that's the most exciting part of the research experience. And openness to that is extraordinarily important. One has to be willing to shift if the preconceived idea of what they were going to find is radically different than what they actually encounter in the field, right? And what people start to tell them. Sometimes this means, a shift of emphasis. Sometimes it requires follow-up, investigating specific details that one was not even aware of prior to, spending time in the field. Sometimes this means we have to say, this is really important, but it's outside the bounds of what I can do right now, but I will at least acknowledge it as well, right? So follow-up addresses these questions, but also in some cases would verify information that's really surprising, for example, right? So if somebody tells you something that is totally outside the bounds of what the stated mission of the organization is or something like that, ideally you would want to be able to verify that in one way or the other through additional interviews or looking at other information as well, right? So that becomes especially important if you're reporting something that people are going to maybe push back on or say, that's not how I would expect things to turn out. Another is self-awareness, and that is just how the researcher accounts for themselves in the process of the data collection, right? So the Hawthorne effect, right? That our presence in the setting can impact the way people behave, the way people respond to us, and an awareness of what that looks like for each person. And I think that is unique in the qualitative data collection experience. And there's quite a large amount of literature on this, especially for ethnography, right? Of how people account for themselves and understand who they are in relation to who they're studying, right? So a few things I wanted to add to this in best practices is trust and rapport, which I think is kind of an under-emphasized but extraordinarily important aspect of the data collection process. So trust facilitates access. If you can gain the trust of gatekeepers, you are going to be able to spend more time in the field, and they're going to help you, right? And I think it's important to just always remember, as social scientists, nobody owes us their time. Nobody owes us their time, and it's very generous, and it relies on a lot of good faith for them to give you access to their world. So facilitating that trust and earning that trust over time is very important, right? So identifying gatekeepers, I note formal and informal, right? So the head of the organization, of course, formal, but sometimes the informal people can really end up being the ones that understand more about the social dynamics of the space, or can really tell you who's going to be most helpful for you for your research and things like that. And then strong rapport in the field, especially with your interviews, right? That enhances the quality of the interview itself. We want to assume, and we hope that when we interview people, that they're going to be honest with us, right? My undergraduate students are always very cynical about that. They're like, they're going to lie to you. And I'm like, well, why would they want to make something up? But I think rapport means that, they understand that you really want to hear from them, that you really are curious about their view of the world. And if they feel that, that will be transmitted in the way that they want to talk to you and spend time with you. Sometimes a long interview can be a sign of good rapport. So if you go past the time, I have a rule, I never cut people off unless it's like gone crazy. So I think I set out to interview a woman for 45 minutes. By the time we got to 3 hours, I was like physically in pain. So I was like, all right, let's take a break now. But, in those types of instances, you can schedule a second follow-up interview, right? So in general, you never cut people off. You let them keep talking and do follow-up. But that rapport enables for, more detailed, more honest and in-depth interviews, I would say. And then again, trust building is ongoing. If you want to do follow-up, if you want to spend more time in the setting, if they trust you, that is possible, right? And the snowball sampling method of you being introduced to others within the community or within the organization, whatever the setting is, that is facilitated as well, right? So somebody can vouch for you and that keeps you in good standing, so to speak, right? But it's good to not take these things for granted and, you know, stay vigilant, I would say, in the way we approach the people we study with some level of sensitivity and mindfulness. I'm sure you guys do cover this in some way, but of course, because research with people, it's not ethically neutral, right? And there should always be ethical considerations baked into the research design and the approach to the field overall, right? So basic respect for persons, so understanding that all people are autonomous, they can choose to be part of the research or not, and that can be revoked at any time, right? And anybody with diminished autonomy that has less power should be protected and treated with very particular consideration, right? And these principles and the emphasis on it has been developed. You know, in the United States, we have it, it's very institutionalized, so everybody has to take ethical training. And before research with human subjects can be conducted, we have to go before a board and submit all the details of our research. It has to be approved. And, you know, this is kind of built out of the history of exploitation and kind of the dark side of what science has done to marginalized communities in particular. So this is now, you know, and I think maybe less likely within the social sciences that abuse could happen, but it's still very possible, and it's important to just, you know, be aware and have it built into the way we approach things. So benefice is about minimizing harm and maximizing benefit for the people you're studying. And then justice, the cost and benefits of participation is fairly distributed, so it doesn't fall unevenly on marginalized communities. And if you have research that could actually benefit in some way, that would be shared and distributed in a timely manner, so to speak. So thinking about through the ethical considerations as well, there is a power differential that happens when one approaches the field in knowledge production overall. So there's some great work, especially from post-colonial theory, looking at this and how knowledge production can create harm, right? And as a social scientist, as ethical social scientists, we should aim to never create harm or re-entrench harm in the ways that we write about the people we study or the research that we do, right? So I've cited Eve Tuck here because she's done some really interesting work and call to arms around suspending damage, so not portraying marginalized communities through a deficit lens in particular, as kind of re-entrenching harmful tropes and language around people that are already marginalized or don't have power or have limited power. Right. And then thinking through safety. So in the context of, you know, the American research infrastructure, we have a lot of protocols around confidentiality and conflict sensitivity as well, that we have to abide by. So this idea that we wouldn't harm the research, that we wouldn't harm our research subjects, which is very important, right? But there's also another element that the researchers should also have their safety in consideration as well. So there's been really welcome, interesting research done, and I cite Hansen and Richards here, about being a woman in the field in particular, right, and gender dynamics. So so much of the research about all the great studies, right, all the classics were done by men. And what does it mean to be a woman in public space and how that impacts collecting data in different ways. So I think this is an important nuance and intervention that can be included in the way we think about collecting data, different gender dynamics that are at play. I really appreciate within the Small and Calarco book, they talk about exposure as a measure of high quality research. So this is a great way to quantify your qualitative, is to count how many hours you spend in the field and how many hours you spend with your research subjects or collecting data itself, right? So the exposure, number of hours in the field and with respondents is a great way to show that, you know, I've spent a lot of time with the people I'm studying, because that can kind of be a hidden amount, quite frankly, right? Especially for people that do year-long, you know, studies that last multiple years. It's very useful for us to be able to account for that in a substantial way. And then the number of interviews is typically less than 40 for the qualitative case study. And that's very much guided by the goals of the research and when one has reached saturation. So if you have enough data to fully tell the story and do it justice, you can move on to writing. Yeah. So there's not necessarily a fetishization of the amount of interviews, right? Even though, of course, you can see that kind of quantitative logic seeping in, and, oh, more interviews is always better. And that's not necessarily the case, right? Quality over quantity is important, and it should be guided by the actual goals of the research itself. So with that, let's pause for a few minutes and have a conversation. What elements would you emphasize in what I've just covered as particularly necessary in the way one approaches the field and data collection? Or are there elements that have not been covered or discussed that you would add to this in terms of best practices? You guys want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. It's been very interesting, all the different topics. Yeah, well, I have one question first. You were talking about gatekeeping, the building trust and, well, generating rapport with them. And you talked about informal gatekeepers. Could you give us an example of that, maybe from your own research? And yeah, well, thinking about these kind of practices, one thing that I'm thinking about my own research is that I'm trying to look into political identity. So the idea of heterogeneity is kind of somewhat conflicted, because I kind of want to give a unit, is the idea, but I can tell that it's very important to have the diverse opinions, to kind of give, you said, like, open up the small universe that are building these groups of people. So I find it very important. It's just that right now I'm kind of struggling with those two ideas. And yeah, well, that's for me.
Okay, great. In terms of informal gatekeepers, I always say this to my students, that usually the secretaries in an institution have more knowledge and power than most people in the institution, and they can facilitate access because they know everybody. They know who gets along, they know who doesn't get along, they know who's going to be helpful or who's likely to blow you off. So in the example I'm going to show you guys a little bit later, I interviewed politicians. And overall, not many responded to me. Go figure. I said, emailing up, they probably get a lot of email, right? So when I physically went there, I went and spoke with the interns and with the administrative staff, and they were helpful in squeezing me in. Oh, well, we have 20 minutes. You can come back a little bit later, and we can sit you down with the person, right? So sometimes there's kind of, layers of people until you get to the person you really want to speak with, right? But then also those staff people could be very interesting as well. So for example, I did interview some of the staff, some of the interns, and then interview the politician as well, right? And they have a different take, a different perspective because of their position, right? And that can be very useful. So I'd say informal gatekeepers, that's in an organizational context. I would say in the community context, that's something that takes a bit of time. Like if one was to do ethnographic research in a community context, that would require some observation and slowly speaking with people. Maybe some elders are the ones that most people go to with their issues or things like that. And these things kind of have a way of revealing themselves. But once you find that person, they can be gold because they're the one that ends up really taking you around, right? So I think in part, identifying the gatekeepers, you don't want to assume somebody can't help you, right? And creating that rapport early that they decide that they want to help you, right? Because it's about people need to be convinced that they want to help you out. And that's not something we can, assume that they will, right? So I would say that about informal gatekeepers. Would you mind saying a little bit more about so your question was about you're studying political identity and heterogeneity. So could you say a bit more about what you're thinking through right now on that?
Okay. Yeah, sure. The thing is that I want to study the anti-populist sentiment in these groups that I have found on Facebook, and even though I have found that there's a great deal of heterogeneity in these groups in the members that are expressing themselves, the idea is that they share some kind of convictions around which they congregate in these groups. So that's kind of how do we go from how diverse is the discourses that they are managing and how they kind of put them together in one line of discursive thoughts or something like that.
Yeah, thank you that's fascinating. Yeah. So, I mean, when we think about, so they kind of share a conviction, maybe they come together around a certain set of political messaging is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think as a qualitative researcher and giving maybe a type of processual account of that, one would be able to kind of peel back how they arrive at that messaging, right? And that process of arriving at that messaging, we would see some heterogeneity, I would imagine, right? So, I mean, heterogeneity, it doesn't mean that you're expected to like go outside of the political group you're interested in, right? But one would expect that over time, the data you collect will reveal that there is a highly textured world within that space, even if on the front, right, they're very politically united, right, behind a set of messaging. Does that
Makes sense?
Yeah.
did you want to go ahead?
I have as well a question in relation with the trust and the development of the report.
Mm-hmm.
How can you do that? I mean, I know that it is important, but how do you do it? And what happens when you don't develop the rapport and the people don't want to be interviewed? And second, I want to answer a little bit the question there. I would emphasize in another element that is self-care and self-empathy, especially when you are working with delicate topics and you have to know your limits and not to put you in danger and that. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent points. So to your question on trust and rapport, I think there's no there's no formula, right? There's no perfect formula. I have a student right now that is struggling to gain access to the people she was so confident that they're we're going to do a study on this organization. They're totally going to respond to me. Everything's going to be easy. And it's a little bit of crickets, right? So there's some troubleshooting that is required for every case, and it's a bit different, right? I would say just general tips. Sometimes showing yourself physically is very useful, right? So in the US, we have a lot of really intense protocols. So we would send an email and we send this 4-page form that's this ethical form with all these signatures. And, you know, people might receive this and be like, what is that? Like, what does this person want? This is really weird. So I would say attending community events, if that's feasible, where you can introduce yourself before starting to ask for questions and kind of build that trust over time, right? And I think that's necessary in particular for some sensitive topics. Like the topic you're working on is extremely sensitive. And with reason, people would be very guarded about who they would let into that space. So I would say, you know, showing up to public spaces that are appropriate if they do any type of public events or anything, attending those, introducing yourself, slowly gaining contact with that setting in any way you can, and then maybe slowly, you know, somebody would facilitate access for you to be able to do interviews over time, right? But I think the expectation that one would arrive on day one and be able to sit down and do an interview with someone that might be highly guarded for a very long set of valid reasons would be unrealistic, right? And I think that's why sometimes it does take time, and you have to kind of put in that time to build that trust and rapport, right? I think once people open up, my experience has been sometimes it takes a while to get the access. And then once the access happens, all of a sudden I'm doing like 10 interviews in a week and a half. And it's really, really busy. But I wouldn't consider things a failure if you haven't gained access yet. But I would say, yeah, it's exposure and showing up where you can so they can get to know you and understand who you are and get an impression of you. Also, if there's an external person that knows someone, like doing an audit of your own personal contacts can be very helpful as well, I would say. Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on this aspect?
I want to say, how do we decide when to do a covert participant observation? Because in these examples, we are studying people that allow us to study them, that they want to be studied in some kind of way. But in other contexts, for example, in mine, I feel that there is a tension between researcher safety and the ethical considerations towards participants in our studies and people's studies. And sometimes I feel, well, maybe that's my own opinion, but it can also be instrumentalized, like researcher safety is often, let's say, used to study people that do not want to be studied. And sometimes because they pose a real danger towards researchers, and if they know that they are being researched, they can do something maybe, I don't know. But how would you, what do you think?
This is very delicate,
Yeah, I
right?
know.
And I'm going to consult with my lawyers first. Yeah. No, well, I think it depends. This is kind of a research design thing that takes time to really unpack how one would approach it in a way that ensures your safety. And doesn't, I mean, in some ways, this is a conflict sensitivity thing. Like, will your presence, is there a risk that things could become worse because the researcher is there, right? Covert participant observation, I don't know how ethical that is, right? And I don't know if that would fly. I would say if you go to a rally, right? And it's a public rally. Like if I go to the 8M march, right? And there's thousands and thousands of people. It's a public event. I think I can be a participant observer in that without really, there's nothing wrong. There's no deception happening. It's a public space, right? When one is entering into private spaces, and there's potentially an element of deception involved in you fully revealing who you are and what you're doing, that becomes highly murky. And I would say, like, in your instance in particular, like, I mean, if these are public online forums and you're doing digital ethnography, you're just kind of an observer, I would say that that wouldn't raise any red flags about safety and, deception itself, right? But I would also maybe look to what other researchers have done that are studying that specific topic to get ideas of how they approached it. Yeah. Because this, I wouldn't, I mean, knowing positionality, I would not be studying that topic personally.
There's also a point that building rapport also has an inherent part of covertness, let's say, like you are hiding something on that, or maybe identifying the gatekeeper, that you are focusing your intent towards someone. I don't know. That's another discussion, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't endorse deception overall. I think, ideally we should be able to, find enough material that's publicly available that we don't have to put ourselves at risk for a thesis. It's not worth it. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Mhm.
The first one is about the Gracias. Do you can say something more about the relevance or the importance of the storytelling to the civil sphere theory when we are doing this kind of research? And the second one is about the Hawthorne effect. Yeah. I'm wondering, is possible that you say something more about this Hawthorne effect, and if you have some concrete or a concrete example of that.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So storytelling, the way I think about it with civil sphere theory is it's happening on more than one level, right? So I think a good interview, ideally, if you can get somebody into the mode of, te voy a contar una historia, like that's a great thing, right? we want our interviewees to tell us a story, right? To give us the gossip, to give us the details. Like this is a good moment as a researcher, right? As an analyst, we then, and we can see this in the case studies when we read them, there's an element of storytelling that one is doing as a social scientist as well, right? So you're taking these kind of smaller narratives and synthesizing them into something bigger, right? And I would say that's the way I'm thinking about this overall, right? But storytelling itself, we can see these smaller narratives can be very revealing in building into the bigger narrative that we're trying to tell about a broader social process. Yeah, I would say. The Hawthorne effect. So researchers write about this a lot, and overall, they always claim, oh, by week 2, they didn't even realize I was there, right? So there's a very famous study, Unequal Childhoods, which is by Annette Leroux, and she is studying child rearing practices of 8-year-olds in working class and middle class American households. And her research team did very in-depth research. They did in-depth ethnography following these families and children around for over a year. So they went to soccer practice, the doctor's appointments, they were in the classroom. They did some sleepovers even in people's households. So they were like really, really present. And they claimed that after a certain amount of time that they faded into the background, right? Which I'm sure is to an extent true. If you're there that often, people get used to your presence, right? But nonetheless, there's an element of maybe there's an internal thing happening with the people that are being studied that they know you're there too. So they're not going to totally let loose either, right? So in that particular study, she talked about using research assistants that were the same race or ethnicity as the families that were being studied. So at least they blended in some way with the community. So it didn't seem like this kind of outsider type of dynamic. So that's maybe just one small example, but within the practice of ethnography, that reflexivity is always required, right? Is a requirement, so to speak. And how much that, I mean, within civil sphere theory, we don't see that written of so much, but ethnography overall, one is accounting for their presence and how that relates to the field, right? And how people are reacting to you. Do they see you as an insider or an outsider? And is that changing, the way that what they're comfortable revealing or not, right? So yeah. Yeah. Any other comments? I know that you had mentioned that the self-care and knowing one's own limits, especially when dealing with highly sensitive research topics. And I think that's a very important, you're right, it's under acknowledged, the psycho-emotional toll research could take on somebody, especially with a highly sensitive topic, right? So I'm aware of some researchers that have kind of support groups or things like that. But there is no one size fits all, but knowing the limits, I think is very important, right? Of oneself, of when one needs to step away. And safety is an ongoing concern as well, right? So that's something that one would be thinking about. And I think there could be a lot of really interesting, that could be a subsection of a methods chapter, or, you could write quite at length about that aspect of that. And that would be kind of an important contribution as well, right? Like, what does it mean to do highly sensitive research? Because I feel that especially, in graduate school, sometimes there's, at least in my experience, there was this, people are encouraged, go for the most intense topic, or go for a topic that you have access to, so you have some personal relationship with the topic, right? So, if you're studying something very sad and you also have been personally impacted by whatever that social problem or social phenomena is, you have a unique insight, you have empathy with the people you're studying in a really profound way, but it's also very hard on you, right, as a researcher. And I definitely can relate to that. Like with the drug overdose research, I have many friends that died of drug overdoses, and that's why I got interested in it, right? And then I'm doing the research on the topic, and you can't fully predict how demanding that will be psychologically, but having those supports, and I think giving account for that is useful, right? And acknowledging the challenges, because you have a unique insight to the topic, but that also comes with a cost that isn't necessarily always recognized. Yeah. So, but I'm glad you mentioned and are thinking about it too. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, disculpe. Yeah. Yeah, just a question about the cognitive empathy element, that you also mentioned that there's kind of work of building a personality that can get to that point. So did I mean, like, why did you mention it? Like, did you do something like that to, or how did you come to find out that it was very important, that it was important to get to that point of looking at your personality to be able to get to the point of empathy, so that people open up, or I don't know. I get that's the point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think So when they talk about cognitive empathy, right? I think it's a habit of mind, right? So that should ideally be happening before we even touch the field or think about the field, right? Especially if we're studying people that are really different than us. We want to say, okay, like, how did they arrive at this, right? What in their world makes this the most logical, rational thing to be doing, or the most desirable thing to be doing, right? So I would say it's a habit of mind, and then that comes through in the approach, right? Like how you embody that is, maybe is highly personal, right? But if people feel judged during an interview, that's like the immediate breakdown of trust and rapport, right? Like if they feel like you're judging them in some way, and of course, we do judge, we do analyze. That's kind of part of being human, right? But suspending that on some level is really important to give people the space to talk and account for how they see the world, right? Because if they feel that you've already made up your mind about who they are and what, if they feel prejudged in some way, like why would they even bother talking to you, right? So having that sincere curiosity, I think it comes through. It's a habit of mind. It's a positionality. And I think it's built through studying. Like we read so many different things, and that builds our curiosity, that builds our cognitive empathy over time. I mean, why else are we interested in producing these thick narrative accounts? Is so, when somebody reads our research, we can appreciate a world that we've never had access to, right? So yeah. Anyone else? Anyone else? No? No? Okay.
12 personas.
Ah, ok, si alguien quiere, si ellos quieren, alguna pregunta, comentario.
Todavía no hay.
Vale, sí. Pues bien. ¿Seguimos?
Sí.
Ok. So thinking through the interview approach a little bit more, I highly endorse, especially for the case study, right? A semi-structured interview approach. It allows for follow-up questions. It prioritizes a natural flow of the conversation. And that in turn builds rapport as well, right? If people don't feel like they're being cut off, or you're forcing your hand too much and guiding the conversation, which of course you need to do at some point, but allowing the conversation to unfold more naturally is a really useful way to approach the interview, and it leaves space for the unexpected, right? I think it's important that you settle on a time that you're going to spend with a person. So, okay, we're going to meet for a half hour. That's out of respect for them, right? Like they want to be able to leave, or, they might have a busy life. I would say for yourself as the researcher, don't schedule something after. So in case it goes over, you have time to hear more. But you can always schedule a follow-up if necessary as well, right? But having the semi-structured, like a set of thematic ideas you want to cover in the interview, but allowing it to kind of unfold naturally. Sometimes, people cover details you were going to ask a question about. So of course you wouldn't ask that again, right? But you can, ask follow-up within that. And then with semi-structured interviews, who are you going to interview? I think the scope should be defined during the research design phase. Overall, we don't want to spread ourselves too thin or end up with a set of data that really can't, as a whole, create almost like a corpus that can kind of speak together in some way, right? When we're thinking about maybe like an emergent meta-narrative, for example, right? So typically those personally impacted by a social problem or issue, relevant professionals or experts, community leaders. And again, the scope of this is, very particular to each individual study of who you would want to spend time with an interview. Sure.
It's about the some social movements or communities in Mexico ask for money when you ask for an
Yes.
interview or some kind of gift or that. Is that ethical or it? How do you think about this interchange of money or gift with the communities or the people that we are interviewing?
Yeah. Great question and point. I think it depends on the setting. I don't think there's something inherently wrong with it though.
Okay.
Right. And in some cases it's totally appropriate and it's really nice to do it. I think it's nice to acknowledge that people's time is valuable. And giving them in some ways a symbolic monetary amount it conveys respect for people's time and expertise. And the expertise of their own lives, if nothing else, right? I would say, I mean, the textbook says, right, that if it reaches a certain amount where it becomes impossible for somebody to say no to that, then it becomes kind of coercive or bribe-like, right? So,
Okay.
If the monetary amount is so high that it, it's like, oh, well, that I could pay my rent with that money, right? Then that becomes problematic, right? But I think within the context, if it's like a nice monetary gesture enough to buy a lunch or something like that, I think that's totally appropriate and welcome if one has the funds to do it. I don't see that as problematic.
Okay.
Yeah. What do you guys think about on that regard? Or how would you approach it? Yeah.
But you have
No, it's
some
nice.
money for lunch or something like that.
Yeah.
Not necessarily money, but for example, if the people needs food or something like that, I think that it can be done without any problem.
Yeah.
But money can generate like a kind of contract. I don't know.
Mm.
I would rather choose food or supplies of any
Yeah.
kind.
Yeah.
Yeah, we also had a professor here at FLACSO that taught us ethnography, and she said that also a recommendation is that you participate with the community in some way. Like she works with how do you say parteras? I don't know how to say that in English, but made I don't know, like women who bring people to the world. Yeah.
Midwives.
Yeah, thank you,
Okay.
midwives. Yeah.
I know, tampoco sabía esta palabra.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, she worked with midwives and she helped with whatever work it was necessary. Yeah. So yeah, like it's not necessary that we give out money, but maybe
Yeah.
we can help in some way with the community, or it's also not like help in that sense, but something that it's agreed upon. So yeah, it's kind of like a give win-win situation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's kind of, I think that goes back to like ethical research overall. So how can, if I have something that can benefit the community, I wouldn't withhold that, or I would offer to help in some way, right? And that's a great way to build trust and rapport. If you have a skill or an access that would be helpful to the community itself, that's highly appreciated. So it's good to mention that. I did research with my drug research. I spent a lot of time in different community settings, and there were a few of them that I really connected with them so well. And so I've maintained relations over many years now. So there's one community group I've been in it's like 8 or 9 years now, right? So, sometimes if they want to apply for a grant, I will proofread, I will look over the materials, right? I'll look at their resumes if they're, looking for a job, things like that. So I have a skill set I'm able to offer that I do, right? Though I've never given them money. Well, actually through grants though I did. I paid participants for their time, right? So I did in one community setting, we did an art and writing workshop with the group, and we paid people to participate. And there are people that were significantly socially marginalized in different ways. So it was appropriate, and it wasn't a crazy amount. It was for 6 sessions, they were given $100 at the end of the time. But I was really happy to do that because that was a help for those people. But it wasn't an amount that could be considered coercive necessarily, right? But it was like a thank you gift, so to speak. Yeah, so these types of things are careful, but I do understand why you would say, oh, if you're the one handing out money, that creates the dynamic, then you're the one with the resource, right? And that immediately creates a kind of an intense power dynamic potentially, right? So buying somebody a lunch or a coffee is a nice way to appreciate their time as well. Yeah, instead of handing out cash. So,
Yeah, but in
yeah.
the case of Adrian, that he's working with incels and something
Yeah.
like that. What kind of change with them is possible in some way?
I don't know. What have you thought about doing?
Yeah.
Let's put you
Yeah,
on the
but-
spot.
Because we're talking about communities and
Sure.
marginalized groups and,
Yeah.
and so on, but in this case, very different.
Yeah,
Very
well,
different.
in the
Yeah.
case that I do in-person interviews, I'm considering like doing paying for the trip and maybe 2 drinks or something like that, something that is let's say objective and pre-accorded between us, because there is maybe a bias on my part, or well, something that I'm considering that maybe they can accept because they want to take advantage of me. So I think it would help me to have it everyone written and decided before we actually do the interview. In the case that we do online interviews, I don't want to pay them anything. I think
Yeah.
that would be the best case scenario. Maybe I can consider it after it happens, but if I say I'm paying you to interview, I'm going to be trolled somehow. So
Yeah.
basically, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's okay to not pay, right?
Yeah.
And just say thank you so much for your time. You've contributed to the scientific enterprise. You know, because it's not feasible for a lot of reasons for that to be kind of the standard that we're paying every single person we talk to, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh.
All right. So thinking through the semi-structured approach, I guess we did talk about a little bit what your experiences are, but I am curious to hear from you a bit more on strengths and challenges of the interview approach overall, right? What can we get out of? What does it have limitations, or what are some of the challenges? We talked about best practices, what we hope to get out of our interviews, but for those that have worked with interview data, if you want to offer
Well,
your opinion and experiences.
Please.
Yes. For example, I think one of the strengths of interviews is the possibility of access to the points of view of people, their experiences, their way of thinking about something. It allows us to gain access to that experience at some point. I think one of the challenges is precisely to gain enough information for different resources to gain a general view of the topic we are working with. What I mean, it is, I don't know, it's always the question, it is enough to give a explanation of what I am working with. Could be a challenge that can be faced in this, with this technique.
My question is more like it's like every time that my students ask me about how I start an interview. I have not problems to answer the question because I have some experience about that, but I'm wondering what kind of strategy or technique do you have to start some kind of interviews like that? If you say your name or you start saying something about the everyday life, how do you broke the ice with the people that you interview? No, this is my question. Just to know how do you do?
Yeah. I've introduced yourself, what you're hoping to get out of the interview, why you're interested in talking to them, right? So conveying that, I think, is usually a good way to start. I would say that's usually how I break the ice. So this is what I'm interested in. This is why I reached out to you. Thank you so much for your time. You know, and this is what I'm hoping to learn from you today. So I'm going to ask you questions about these themes, right? And also, of course, if there's anything you don't want to talk about, just say pass, and we can move on. You know, so getting that permission, and also making it clear that, you know, if there are things that they don't want to cover, that there's no penalty to not. So they're not obligated, right? So I would say that's kind of how I usually get the ball rolling. I don't like to say too much, but I always will say, do you have any questions for me before we get started?
Okay.
You know, and that's helpful. The most intense I've ever had is the politician I interviewed. He was a very paranoid man. And so he wanted to have his wife and 2 other staff in the room as well. Plus he wanted to record the interview himself as I was recording it. So I was like, sure, you can record me. I have nothing to hide. And he grilled me for a few minutes about who I was and my background. And so I was in the hot seat, and, you know, I managed through it. And then we had an interesting interview for about 45 minutes. So I think it's, you know, every once in a while you'll be in the hot seat and you have to be ready to explain who you are. That's why the deception thing for me is I don't really, you know, I always try to be as forthcoming as possible about what I'm trying to get out of my time with my interviewees. And then I would say, like, once you're in the interview, depending on how many you've already done, sometimes it's helpful. You can kind of create a conversation by saying, oh, well, you know, what I've been hearing from other people is this is very important to them. What would you say to that? Or has that been your experience as well? So that can kind of be a way of fortifying thematic things that are coming through with the interviews as well after you've gotten some momentum, right? But obviously not with the first one. Yeah.
I have another
Yes.
question. How to know how many interviews you may conduct? I mean, when is enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's everyone's right. When your advisor says no. There's a nice paper by Mario Small called How Many Cases Do I Need? It was published in 2009. It's very highly cited. I wonder if I have it. Did I add it in here? I didn't, but it's the same scholar that did the Small and Calarco. But in any case, it's really when you reach saturation, right? So saturation doesn't mean you're tired, but it means you are hearing, you're starting to predict what people are telling you, right? You're anticipating, and you're really starting to feel like, okay, I've mastered the narrative, right? Like, I can do more interviews, but all it's going to do is I'm just going to build out more and more and more of the same types of stories, right? So it's very specific to the topic and study itself, right? But saturation is once you've really collected enough material that you can give justice to the topic itself, right? I wouldn't say, you know, doing a very, very small number can be risky, right? But if they're very in-depth interviews, if you spend hours, right, there's a life history, oral history interviews or something like that, it can be a very small N. It can be very, very fruitful, right? Depending on the goals of the research, right? For feasibility, right, we want to think about the different types of interviews and kind of breaking those up as well. So like when I did the drug research, I had kind of two main groups. So I had the experts and then the personally affected, right? So the personally affected, you know, I wanted a certain amount of people, right, that I could get. And that became clear once I was doing the research that I was starting to hear a lot of the same themes. But then you want to confirm, right? Just because you've heard the same theme many times, right? You still want to kind of build that out. So that saturation point is kind of decided by the researcher. And then I would say, and we're not covering this explicitly today, but you know, if you're in the field, if you're doing participant observation, ethnographic observation, in addition to interviews, one would expect you're collecting additional materials that are also building out the story you're able to tell, right? Empirically robust, right? So I would say, you know, typically no more than 40, right? Some of the stuff like the case I'm looking, I'll show you the paper I published recently. It's just 16 interviews, right? But they were expert interviews. And I drew on secondary materials as well to build out the case itself. So yeah. Any other comments? Yeah.
Could we have the references?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, sure. Of course. Yeah, I can put those together for you for tomorrow. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So how's everyone doing? Good?
Questions? We have 3 minutes to close the session.
Yeah.
To have something more.
I do, yeah. I mean, I can go into an example of interview. I have more material, but if people are, I don't want to exhaust, yes, is there saturation? So
Questions?
we can keep going. Yeah. Yeah, please.
I have a question, maybe a small question to go to your case example. I was thinking if there has been a case where you have to share something about yourself because the interviewee asked you about it, like how in this example where the other person was also recording yourself, recording you and asking questions about yourself. How do you decide what to share and what not to share? Because sometimes maybe there's something that you are uncomfortable about when the person asks you about it.
Sure, I think it's a highly personal, right? But I would approach it in a professional manner overall, I would say. So, in the sense that, you know, I would talk about things I would feel comfortable revealing at work or putting in my, that's on my bio on the school website, right? About, you know, where I've studied and, you know, things that are, you know, within the bounds of, you know, publicly accessible information, right? Anything beyond that, if you to personalize, that's a highly individual choice of whether that would be appropriate or wanted, right? And I think there's a gender dynamic there that could play out, right? And you know, navigating those situations in a way that, you know, if you become so uncomfortable that you don't want to do the interview anymore, like maybe it's time to go, you know? So, you know, ideally that situation doesn't come up, but you know, that, you know, in thinking through who you're interviewing and creating those plans in a way that you're in a comfortable position or like putting yourself in the best position you can ahead of time is important. So like deciding where you're going to do the interview, for example, like, is it a semi-public or private place, right? That's important for the comfort of the person you're interviewing, right? If they're revealing something that's highly personal to them, but also you need to have your own safety and comfort in mind as well, right? So maybe, like I've had interviewees say, oh, well, you can come over to my house at 6 p.m. I'm like, you're a man I've never met, and that is definitely not going to happen. Like, I guess we'll have a phone interview, you know, like I can't assume that like, I don't know you. Like, I'm not gonna, so there's a bit of common sense at play, right? But yeah, so there's no hard and fast, right? It requires a lot of personal judgment. Yeah.
I think that you are saying that because
Yeah.
because the incel group, I think so, no?
Yes, also, I'm not sure if there is something inherently unprofessional about oversharing about yourself,
Mhm.
like in the most general scenario. Because in an ideal case, you wouldn't say something about you. You want to listen to the people that you are interviewing, but there are, I don't know, cases.
But sometimes that enables them to feel more comfortable, right? There are some things that are helpful to say, right? Like I would say when I was interviewing, mothers whose children died of a drug overdose, I'd say, I know, I have many classmates and friends that died of the same thing, right? So that created a connection with the person I was interviewing that wasn't possible otherwise. But that was highly specific to the research itself. I would say like for your specific instance, I would look at, best practices for even, people that have done research with terrorist groups or things like that, how do they manage their own safety and gain access? Because, yeah, this is it's sensitive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
All right. So we can look at this for a little bit and then wrap it up. But thinking through now, so what I wanted to do today was just kind of put us all on the same page, so to speak. So we've talked about the civil sphere theory. We talked about what are best practices for qualitative data collection overall, and, raise some questions and concerns. And, I think what's emerged also is that it depends is often the answer, right? And it requires, good judgment in consultation with other, experienced researchers that can kind of help guide you, especially if you're dealing with, if you're ambitious in terms of trying to gain access to something very balkanized. So thinking through how do we actually use interview data to our advantage to advance the case study and to advance civil sphere theory itself, right? Thinking through how to work the binaries. So putting interview data to work, to work the binaries itself, right? So this paper I'm showing, and I figured I would just give a little bit of a backstory to how I arrived to it, and that would be helpful, is a case study of voting reform in Alaska. And it is advancing civil sphere theory discussions of the practice of social solidarity and the vital center in governance. So one of the regulative institutions of the civil sphere. And the data I used were semi-structured interviews with policy experts and politicians, in addition to secondary reports, literature, journalistic accounts, and publicly available political speeches and meetings as well for this. So the context of this study was a comparative case study of 3 ideal cases of approaches to fortify American democracy. And this research was done while I was at a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University, working with a team of political scientists and a few policy experts as well, in thinking through how different groups are attempting to fortify and enhance democratic culture in American society, right? So there is widening concern, perhaps globally, about the political state that the United States has found itself in. So this study, we looked at institutional, collective, and interpersonal level interventions. So the one I'm looking at and showing you today is the institutional level of voting reform, but we also looked, and so for the research, I'll just say it was a team, so we came we worked together for the overall design of the study, but I was the sole researcher on the study, so I did all the data collection and synthesis. That was my job. So the institutional voting reform in Alaska, the collective, we looked at, or I looked at shared governance in a community setting, and that particular community setting was a collaborative forest management. So managing a huge amount of forest in Central Oregon in an area that has had a lot of social conflict about resource management. So in the 90s, that was called the timber wars. So environmentalists breaking loggers' equipment and things like that. So it's kind of a conflict setting, but over time, people have emerged and come together to share use of the forest. So a number of over 50 stakeholders are involved in this collaborative. So that was the collective setting I spent time in. And then on the interpersonal level, there are these groups called bridging groups that do intentional dialogue with political adversaries, and it's kind of guided political dialogue. And I presented my paper to you guys last year, so I don't know if any of the students were there, but that it's part of this bigger project. So that's kind of the background. And overall, for this project, I did 47 interviews in the span of 3 months, and I did a rapid ethnography approach. So I had a lot of front end planning and communication with the site. I did some phone and Zoom interviews before I got there, and then in some instances, I would just be there for 10 days and be following everybody around. So it would be like, I just did 50 hours of contact, like in person, in a short amount of time, collecting as much as I could. But that required, some front end planning. And all this to say, and we can talk about this tomorrow, this kind of rapid ethnography approach, I think is actually, I really like it. It's it's like the neoliberal dream for data collection, right? Because you just go in and you get as much as you can. It requires a lot of planning, but especially with a team, it can be very useful. And I didn't know even existed, but it's quite popular in the public health setting in particular, right? So they'll go into a neighborhood with a team of 10 and do kind of a data blitz, so to speak, of lots and lots of interviews and observation in a short amount of time. So especially if you're doing comparative research, like in a number of settings, this, for feasibility, it has to be this way, right? Where you kind of dive in, you go do a data collection blitz, and then you leave and sort through it all.
Did you spend in Alaska on the winter or?
I went in the spring,
Okay.
but there was still snow.
Okay.
Yeah, I was in Juneau, which is it's a rainforest climate. So there was a lot of snow on the ground, and it's typically very rainy there. So it's probably about like 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. So not that bad, actually. The weather where I come from is so bad in the winter that it was like, yeah. But it was exciting to go to Alaska for sure. It was beautiful. So just a little bit of background, and then we'll move through because we don't have so much time. But ranked choice voting itself, why is this a voting system that a lot of democratic reformers are interested in? And by democratic reformers, there's this broader movement called the democracy reform movement that's attempting to enhance more democratic outcomes. So re-democratizing elections, so to speak, is what they really frame these types of reforms as. And ranked choice voting is a form of proportional representation that has gained a lot of momentum. So cities and states have had it on the ballot to actually change the way that they elect their representatives. Overall, it is politically agnostic. So ranked choice voting does not inherently favor liberal or conservative candidates, right? But it does change dynamics in terms of who can run and creates competition within parties because, for example, in the Alaska model, who ends up on the ballot after the open primary, which can be many, many people run for the open primary, the top 4 people are then remain, and then those are ranked in order, right? So it creates healthy competition within a party, which is really useful if a state always elects the same party no matter what, right? So like I live in Rhode Island, 66% Democrat. So we're always going to get a Democrat. But having competition within the Democratic Party for citizens kind of in the ideal sense, it should enhance the democratic process in some way, right? Because it's not taken for granted that this specific candidate will win, right? So Alaska was the second state to adopt it in 2020, and it had its first elections in 2022. So I did the research in 2023, so it was the first legislative session with this new voting reform. And what I wanted to understand was, does this enhance civility in governance like people claim it does? Does this actually make the democratic process better for legislators? So that was what I spent time asking. So the original research was very applied. The first product was a policy report looking at these 3 cases, and then I left with all this data in hand and used the tools of civil sphere theory to kind of reanalyze the data through that lens. And so that's how I approached the data analysis itself. So thinking through civil sphere theory, I looked at the vital center and the vital center in governance. And the vital center as a concept is quite old. It was originally coined by Arthur Schlesinger, and he writes, it reunites individuals and community in a fruitful union and is led by a spirit of human decency, right? And he was writing about a time that there was the emerging Cold War and Red Scare and things like that. So he was talking about kind of reconciling these and thinking about what is the commonality that binds us all, even if there is a political disagreement that is inevitable as a part of politics, right? So the vital center within civil sphere theory is a more broad term that is understood as just the practice of social solidarity in democratic societies, right? And there's a nice amount of emerging research on what this means in different institutions of the civil sphere, right? But an important aspect of it is that it's dynamic and it can be pulled towards more progressive or regressive directions. And in a time of political backlash, one would imagine it's floating to the right or being pulled to the right quite quickly. And then in the context of, American political culture, scholars have argued that the vital center is really necessary within governance and within politics through a coalition, a cross-party coalition of people that are an anti-authoritarian alliance of committed liberal Democrats that spans the partisan divide between Republicans and Democrats. So this became kind of an emergent important thing is, okay, is there diversity within the Republican Party that is not interested in talking about election fraud and doing a lot of things to undermine basic civil liberties and still, believes in a more like classic liberal approach to democratic politics, right? So I'll just jump to the methods. So 12 elected officials and staff. It's the smallest legislature in the United States. And they're all in this building, which was very useful. So I could just kind of run up and down the floors and try to talk to different people. I sent out emails to everybody, and then I went door knocking as well, so to speak, to the different offices. So I ended up interviewing roughly 20% of elected officials or their staff in this short period. And I also spoke to a few policy experts and journalists prior to doing the time in Alaska to get some momentum on understanding the political culture of Alaska itself and what this reform meant to them, what their insights were. And that was really just to gain more knowledge on the case because, you know, this was something, you know, I'd never been to Alaska prior to this research. So I really had a lot of learning to do in a short amount of time. So in terms of how the ranked choice voting played out, it was a competitive midterm. It had similar turnout to other prior elections, like within general fluctuations of the last 20 years, right? But there were some victors that were really remarkable in terms of their crossover appeal that people attributed their wins to the new form of voting. Significantly, Mary Peltola was the first Democrat to hold the seat in the House of Representatives in over 50 years, and she was the first Alaska Native person ever elected to the House of Representatives. So this was a very exciting development for a lot of reasons. And then centrist Republican Kathy Giesel and Lisa Murkowski were also noted for their crossover appeal, and they are prominent on the national stage for standing up to Trump within the Republican Party. So kind of different groups. So what I found spending time was that people favored ranked choice voting overall, and the ones that did, they celebrated bipartisanship, moderation, and they characterized the process itself as more representative of the people of Alaska. So for example, more than half of Alaskans are not registered with the Democrat or Republican Party, or they're independents. So giving this independent spirited electorate more options was hailed as more democratic and more representative of the populace overall. So and now we can look at some pulling from the interviews. So the Vital Center, we see people talking about it. So this belief in bipartisan governance. So Senator Kathy Giesel, when I interviewed her, she says, when you're making public policy, it requires all hands, all thoughts, all opinions. I work with all sides, and I find that's the only real way to get good policy done. So she's really talking about, you know, I want to collaborate and not this kind of hardline political sparring one would expect from the contemporary Republican Party, right? So this was very interesting. And then others, so another senator writes, or said, instead of appealing to the fringes of the party, they're required to appeal to a broader base of voters, right? Because they aren't just speaking to that small group or relatively small group within their party that is really captured by a more extreme hard right version, right? So more representative, again, talking about how most voters are nonpartisan and how this approach and reform spoke to them. So more of an emphasis on participation and less of an emphasis on party. So again, kind of this uniting idea behind both the mechanism itself and then the outcome of governance. So I found that the Vital Center did expand and people invoked these kind of broader universal ideals, which was very exciting. But there's no American politics without backlash today. So I did find there is a very strong backlash movement to repeal the reform itself, right? And this got started just days after the reform was passed. They had a ballot going around attempting to overturn it. They got it on the 2024 ballot to repeal, and it lost by only 600 votes. So it was it was almost repealed, basically. So when I spoke to people, this was the people that were passionately against the ranked choice voting reform were the further right I went with the people I interviewed, the more they hated it, essentially, is what I found. And this was significant to me because I was coming at this from reading all this policy and political science literature that was like, this is great for everybody. There's no reason that people would object to this, but this really undermined kind of entrenched norms and political gaming that people do, because people, of course, are going to try to game and campaign to the form itself in different ways. So there was a strong backlash by some Republicans against this. So how did they talk about this, right? So one characterized it as dishonest. So the campaign itself to repeal, they said, Alaskans were tricked, they were sold this bill of goods. They didn't even realize what they were doing when they voted for the reform. So the reform itself changed the electoral system, but also changed campaign finance. So they added more transparency. So the main messaging of the campaign was that they were going to get dark money out of politics. So people took issue with this, that this was dishonest, that they led with the dark money, but then underhandedly also changed the voting system too, right? There were procedural critiques as well. So one Politico said, when I hear reform, election reform, that's code for we can't win under the current rules, so we're going to try to change the rules so we can win, right? This one I think is kind of the most dangerous, I would say, right? And then others talked about the Vital Center is just inauthentic, right? So when you get a candidate that's not one way or the other, kind of middle of the road, it's more of a chameleon in the room who just says whatever just to get that vote, right? So they're being disingenuous, and having really strong line political positions enables the electorate to decide who they really want, right? And then is a betrayal to party. So he said that, and this person, he was really against them, the reform, and had a lot of problems within the Republican Party over this, right? And he said, people are still making up lies about each other. They're still throwing dirt and mud, and the money's pouring in. There's no difference since this change has happened. People are just as nasty as ever, right? So what did I conclude and learn from this? So I was able to pull out kind of all this rich language through my interviews and kind of explain, a nuanced approach to how, the Vital Center expands, but there's also a backlash that is kind of saying, this Vital Center is totally illegitimate, or the people that are there just really lying, performing, et cetera, right? So what I conclude in the paper, and came away with from the research is that this did reinvigorate the Vital Center. And I think this electoral reform does that in some ways because it incentivizes people to collaborate across parties. But there is that vocal minority that is still extraordinarily threatened by electoral reform. And what I found was, or what I assert is that ranked choice voting, though well-intended to re-democratize elections, it draws new ire to the process itself in a way that is potentially very dangerous, right? And that the actual mechanisms and the electoral system itself becomes the locus of political struggle, right? So what I argue is that this really marks a shift to constitutional politics, where political struggle is about changing the rules of the game and not just, ordinary, boring policy sparring within governance itself. So we are at our time.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it at that. So we can, maybe pick up and talk a little bit about the interview process itself and look at some other examples tomorrow. I don't know if anyone have any comments or questions right now before we end their time.
Questions? Well, for me, it's very interesting how you took these statements of the senators and politicians, and to illustrate your position or your analysis. How do you select these statements that you put in the PowerPoint? Just to know that if some kind of different statements that point to the same argument. Why do you choose? Did you choose these statements?
Why did I choose these statements?
Yes, your
Mhm.
methodology to this.
Sure.
Say, okay, the Senator Mike Shower, it's the great example of about this argument.
Sure, sure. Well, thinking through because it's a small number of interviews, right? It's just 16. I'm able to have a transcript, read and reread and do a thematic analysis. I literally print it out and by hand make notes on the transcript itself, which may not be feasible for huge amounts of data, but it was in this instance. So the themes kind of came through, but then how do I choose the quotes? Well, going back to the binaries, what is that sharp language, that binary language where people are really distinguishing, right? An exclusion and an exclusion, character assassination or making strong delineated points about the character of people. Those types of things really stood out to me, right? In the instance for backlash, right? And then for the vital center, thinking through, how are people when are people using a language that's more universalizing, that's more Big Ten, right? Things of that nature. So in some ways it's a process of elimination, but looking for that when the strong language comes through, it becomes quite clear,
Okay.
when they're making those kind of delineating who is and who isn't, right? Those periods of belonging, who's part of the group, who's not part of the group, who's a friend or an enemy,
Yeah.
right? These types of things. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, but uh, thinking about your answer, there isn't an instance where maybe a Democrat or whoever who defends the reform has a different register, maybe using offenses and all that kind of language that is, I don't know, in the terms of the binaries on civil,
Mhm.
and so how do you consider that person that for one instance can be considered as a civil regarding the reform and what does it does to gather everyone in a vital center and all that, but when they because that's the way I think American politics is doing it right now, that everyone wants to have to say a word just to get the headline, like to be somewhat alarmistic or something like that. But at the end, they also want to have this kind of more civil and more dialogue. So I don't know if there's any case that can be considered in that scenario.
So to understand your question, so people that were invoking kind of a more universalistic language, but then still using that verbal sparring of anti-civil language in some instances, is that what you mean?
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe towards the people that are detracting the
Mhm.
reform. Yeah, like these two cases of at the end.
Yeah.
Like maybe people that are going to spar with those
Mhm.
that for one part were civil around the reform, but maybe uncivil around their opponents. Well, this kind of people.
Yeah. So in this, what I found was that, they were uncivil about the reform, right? So their critique was both about their opponents, not so I understand what you're saying. So this last one is talking about, okay, the political culture didn't change, right? But they also simultaneously took issue with the reform itself, right? As undermining what they would understand as good governance, right? So in this specific instance, there's a caucus. It's just 20 state legislators, and so they formed a bipartisan caucus. And so even though it's a Republican majority state Senate, so it's, I believe it was 13 Republican senators and 7 Democratic senators, they still formed a bipartisan caucus with 17 out of the 20 members. And the 3 people that chose to not join that bipartisan caucus, Senator Mike Shower was among them, right? So he was kind of sidelined and marginalized within the function of the state Senate itself, right? Because he didn't want to cross party lines. So he saw people that had joined that bipartisan caucus as, they're betraying their own party, they're inauthentic, right? And they talked about, they said, oh, they put us in they bust us back to the worst offices in the whole building, and we don't have any meaningful assignments. And here's this brilliant man who's a decorated war hero, who has been totally marginalized within state governance, right? So they took issue they took issue with the process, but then also the people that bought into that process. So that's why there was that sparring against their own within their own party over it as well. Yeah. Yeah. Sí, sí, está bien, está bien.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias.
Sí, a ustedes. Gracias.
Me quedaron mañana con la segunda parte.
Muy bien.
Entonces,
Muy bien.
no tenemos ninguna pregunta por internet.
No.
Entonces, pero tuvimos 12 personas a final de cuentas.
Muy bien.
Entonces, mañana muy probablemente tendremos más.
Sí, muchas gracias a ustedes por sus preguntas y participación.
Misma hora.
Sí.
Sí, por supuesto. Ya